I was born and brought up on the Wirral,
Oh, yes.
and on the south side of the Wirral, that's on the River Dee. And my parents are both Scottish, came south in their 20s, and my father was a banker in Liverpool. So Liverpool was very much my home city,
Yeah.
and a wonderful city it was before the war. It was so prosperous and so lively. I've been up very recently.
Yes, there's lots to go on.
Particularly I wanted to go this year because it's the year of culture.
Yeah.
And I was thrilled with it because when I saw it last time, it was just after the very bad bombing, and it was simply ghastly, so
Yes.
depressing.
Yes.
And all the streets were deserted, and it was incredibly depressing. So I was delighted to see it renewed.
Yes.
But I lost my home during the Liverpool raids. We had a £1,000 bomb on it, and we were all buried alive. Well, we were all sitting in the hall, and it was about 2 in the morning. My parents had endured many, many nights of the Liverpool bombing, but they'd given up getting up during the raids. But that day my mother had a premonition, hauled us all out of bed and took us down to the hall. And we had 2 sisters evacuated from Birkenhead. They'd been bombed out there. And suddenly, of course you don't hear the bomb that hits you. Everything collapsed on us. I was just like in a little coffin. I could just put my hand up about as far as that.
How old are you then? How old
I
are you?
was 19.
19, yeah.
And I didn't know where my parents were, but I found my mother just beside me, and she was in a very precarious position, with a great beam in her back pushing her down. And my father had been knocked away and was looking up at the stars with a beam across his middle, so he couldn't get up. Well, the ARP people were absolutely marvellous.
I think we'll have to say that's air raid.
Air raid precaution.
Thank you. Right.
And they were there within minutes and calling to us. They didn't expect to find anybody alive. But one of the 2 sisters was killed beside me in a horrible choking noise I'll never forget. But they made a hole through a bit of the dining room wall, which was still standing, and managed to haul me out sideways. And they got my father up, but they obviously didn't know what to do about my mother, because the whole house was on top of her. And my father remembered that we had very deep foundations under the house, and so they got into the foundations, took a stretcher along to where my mother was, and made a hole, and pulled her down and back through the foundations. Otherwise they never got her out at all.
That's an unbelievable story. Yeah.
Well, I didn't really suffer with the shock, partly because I was the only member of the family who was there to cope. So we had to arrange what to do with bits of furniture and things which had survived, and many things were dug out. But I got a week's bomb leave from the Fannies.
Now you're going to have to tell me exactly what Fanny stands for.
No. Well, the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry
Right.
just had their centenary, and they started in 1907 with nursing staff, and it was all voluntary. They did a great deal during the First World War, and actually ran some field hospitals, and did a lot of ambulance driving out on the front. Then during the 1939 war, they were persuaded to amalgamate, partly link themselves with the air transport, the ATS.
Yes.
They weren't very happy about that. There were still some free fannies who parachuted into France, like Odette and people. But most of the fannies in Chester were either in intelligence or they were driving ambulances and staff cars.
Can I just ask if you were you trained as a nurse and that's how you went into it?
I wasn't, no.
No.
Brenda, my sister, had joined the fannies a few months before, and I had decided that I wanted to. So I
Just to join the war effort, this was?
Yes.
Yes, sure.
I had been going up to Oxford if it hadn't been for the war, but I decided I wanted to join the forces. So I did a clerical course first, and then joined the fannies. And I was just doing clerical work, petrol accounting. And
Not very exciting.
It wasn't a bit exciting. There were about 150 vehicles of various kinds. And the fannies, bless their hearts, were always expected to fill in what was called a work ticket every day. And it had starting times and finishing times, and starting times how much petrol they drew and how much was left at the end of the day. And it was quite complicated and they hated doing it. So they used to come into the office in rather a bad state. And so I'm afraid I had to do quite a lot of tinkering. Because I had to take them along to the army auditor in Chester to have them checked.
Yeah.
Anyway, after a year of that, I wasn't experienced enough to be a fanny driver. I was looking out for something else, and a notice came round, would people be willing to be trained as radio mechanics? Well, of course, we hadn't the foggiest notion what that meant.
But you said yes.
So I thought it might be something to do with getting in touch with glamorous pilots or something, you know, and I thought it sounded rather fun. So off I went to London, to Montague Square, where we were billeted, and we had to march up from Montague Square every morning to the Rene Street Polytechnic, where we did our training.
At what distance is that?
Oh, quite a long way, all the way up Wimpole Street.
Yeah.
A good 20 minutes march.
Okay.
Before breakfast, mind you.
Yes.
In the winter.
Yes. Yes.
And we had a terrible, terrible ATS sergeant in charge of us who wasn't on the course.
This is also a woman sergeant, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh yes, very much so. She was a typical caricature sergeant. And she was to line us up before we marched, and she had a torch, and of course it was pitch dark when we started off, and she used to shine this torch onto our greatcoats to see if we'd cleaned our buttons. And then she made us open our greatcoats to see if the buttons underneath were also polished,
Unbelievable.
all before we had to start up to have our breakfast.
And if they weren't?
Hmm?
And if they weren't polished? Were you
Oh,
sent back to do
goodness
it?
knows, I don't know. I never
You always polish.
discovered.
Okay, you always
I think
polish
we were
yours.
pretty all right.
Mm.
The funniest thing was, one day she decided she would have a gas mask drill. So there were 3 commands. You brought your gas mask round to the front onto your chest, and then 2, you put your hand like that to undo it, and 3, you pulled, and you can imagine what happened. There were everything you can think of inside our gas mask cases, besides the gas mask.
But it was a surprise inspection, was it? It was a surprise inspection of gas masks.
Yes.
So 1, 2, 3, and lipsticks and combs and
everything
spare
flying
knickers.
all over the road. Yes.
Yes.
Anyway, the course was extremely interesting, but very hard work indeed. We had to learn all about wireless theory at that stage. It wasn't a secret equipment. So we had 3 months of learning about how valves worked and how generators worked. And then we also had some workshop practice. We had a dear little man, bald-headed man, who took us there, and he was so polite and nice to us all. But we had to learn how to use a lathe and how to use micrometers and how to file and solder and all the things that we would need later.
Can you just tell me, you said you were going to Oxford. What were you going to do sciences in Oxford?
No, I wasn't. No.
So this is completely...
For a higher school certificate, I only took languages.
Yes, so
I
you're
took
completely
science
green to science and anything to do with your hands, really?
No.
Yeah,
No,
fine.
it was
Interesting.
all completely new.
Yes.
So he taught us extremely well, and we made our own tools. We made box files and box spanners and flat spanners and set squares and all sorts of. I still got mine. I'm very proud of them.
What I sort of want to know was, were they... Here's a bunch of young women who probably are quite clueless about making things and everything else.
Yes.
Were they patronising or were they really nice to you?
Well, they what?
Were they patronising? Or did you find them just very nice and encouraging, these chaps who were teaching you?
Oh, very nice and
Yes.
encouraging. They weren't patronising at all, no.
Yes, great.
But this little man who's taught us the workshop practice was so funny. He was so polite, you see. And there were 3 kinds of files we had to use. And the middle one had a special name, he said. But I don't really want to tell you the name. But the last day of the course, we persuaded him to let us know. And he said, in very embarrassed sort of way, "It's a bastard file."
Now,
I'll never
doesn't...
forget that.
Yes. Now, isn't that a sign of the times and how different it would be now?
Yes.
I thought you were going to say something terribly sexual. Didn't you? Yes.
So then we had Christmas, and we were sent up to Gainsborough in Lincolnshire for our specialist radar training. And we were so excited because none of us knew anything about radar. It was still called radio location at that stage, but I'll call it radar, it's easier. And we were taught in a big camp with Nissen huts for lecture rooms. And it was winter, it was January, February, and a very, very cruel winter. And the whole place was very ramshackle. We would sit in our greatcoats, huddled like this, with our boots and everything on, and listening to these lectures. And there used to be holes in the roof, and the snow, which was beginning to melt, would sometimes come through and form puddles. At other times, it was so cold in the lecture room that the snow came through and didn't even melt on the floor. we were covered with chilblains, and we were very, very exhausted.
I'm also very glad you're recording that, because I think the young have no idea now how tough life was.
No.
And this is wonderful to record this. You know, I mean, actually, in our country hardly anybody's cold. You might get a little bit feeling chilly, but not that kind of cold, not that kind of chilblain cold.
No.
It's incredible.
No. Anyway, we were so thrilled with learning about radar that we didn't care at all. We really didn't. We were full of beans and had a great time. But,
Now, this is all fannies. This is all
oh no,
women?
not fannies, no. I
No.
left the fannies in Chester.
Right, okay.
And we were a mixed bunch.
So what are you called now? What is your...
Well, we were ATS,
And that is? You're going to have to spell that out?
Auxiliary Territorial Service.
Auxiliary Territorial Service.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
And so it is men and women?
No, this
No.
is all women.
It is all women, okay.
At that stage, until we went to Gainsborough.
Right,
Then it was mixed.
yes. Well, that's why you had more fun.
Yes, of
Yeah.
course. Of course we did. And we used to frequent all the local pubs and really behaved in a way that I think my parents would have thought it pretty disgraceful.
Good.
We had snow fights and we had, well, when we went to the pubs we sang the whole evening, so we had quite a good repertoire of the local songs.
Can you remember any of the songs from that time? Was it Vera Lynn kind of things?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh yes. She'll be coming. She'll be wearing silk pajamas when she comes. There's one.
Yes.
I probably remember lots of them.
Yeah.
But anyway, we finished the course, and the girls did awfully well actually. Apart from one man at the top, the girls beat most of the men because we worked so hard. We really did.
Was it just that you were more conscientious, or what, do you think? Why did you beat the men? That's very interesting.
Yes, I think it was.
Yeah.
I think the men were just as intelligent.
They just thought they could sail through.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, then there were about 30 ATS girls in our bunch. We were posted to Greenford, to the ordnance depot there.
Where is Greenford?
Up the Great North Road.
Okay, so
Yes,
the north of
going out
London.
of London,
Okay.
but still in London. And Greenford was like a town almost. It had a main street with side streets and a railway line running across the top with unloading bays. All the ordnance work, we had guns and everything there. We had our radar shop, and we had the most marvellous staff sergeants teaching us what to do there. Now, at that stage, we were doing what was called fourth line maintenance, which meant we weren't going out to the gun sites at all. We were confined to the ordnance depot, and we had various radar sets sent in to us to be repaired, and most of them came from the south coast. Some had been bombed and some had been set on fire with incendiaries, and some had blood on the floor, and some were quite badly damaged, others were only slightly damaged. But you see, at that stage the radar was so new, they were desperately short of the various sets.
Yeah.
So it was urgent that we got them working again.
So this is where all your soldering and metalworking
Yes.
skills came in.
Yes.
Can you just tell me how long were you at Gainsborough and how long were you at the next place?
Gainsborough, I think, was 3 months.
Yes.
Or 3, maybe 4.
Mm.
And Greenford, I think I was there about a year.
Yeah.
But we had the most terrible hours. We worked, they put our hours up to 60 hours a week. and that meant we worked all day Saturdays, and I'm not sure we didn't work part of Sunday as well. But they discovered that our work fell off because we were too tired,
Yes.
so they reduced the hours again.
Yes.
But it was all to do with the urgency of getting things back in use again.
So you wouldn't mind, really? You just knew it was for the war effort and it was important,
Yes.
and you just got stuck in
Yes.
it. Yeah.
And we learnt a lot of very useful things there. We learnt how to use circuit diagrams and how to read blueprints and all sorts of things which we actually needed later.
Yeah.
So then my next posting was up to within 20 miles of my old home, believe it or not, up on the Wirral at Upton.
You still with the ATS?
No, we were posted to a REME company, REME,
And that stands for?
Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers.
Terrific.
I'll call them REME in future.
That's fine,
It's
yes.
too much of a mouthful.
Yes.
So we posted up to this REME workshop, and we had the most delightful male captain in charge of us. And it must have been a tremendous invasion for them, because up to then they'd only had male mechanics, and there were 30 new girls coming to join them. And they took it all in their stride. They were absolutely wonderful.
Were they impressed with how good you were? Because it must have been culturally so different that here were these women coming up as engineers, as experts in
Yes.
radar and radio. It must have been
Yes.
quite a shock for them.
They didn't betray any signs
Okay.
of shock.
Okay.
They just treated us as one of themselves,
Yeah.
you know. And we used to go out to the gun sites to service the radar from the workshop every day. And sometimes they would send one male corporal and another man and two girls, and we were just a team working
Yeah.
together. And there was never any question of always the man in charge. We were just treated like equals. It was
Fantastic.
absolutely amazing, really.
Mm.
So we had a very interesting time there. We serviced a Speak aerodrome radar, and one of our favourite excursions was to the Coronation, which was a small dredger which came into Liverpool to be serviced at times and sailed round Liverpool Bay with its radar on board. And when it came into dock, we went out to service it.
Was that a sort of, it was a dredger, but,
Yes, it was a converted dredger.
okay, so it's still
Yes.
looking like a dredger.
Oh, no, not really.
it
It
wasn't,
was very
okay.
smart
All right.
and beautifully clean, of course.
Mm.
And I remember the first time we went, I had to go down to switch on the generator, because every radar was working with a generator. And I had to go down into this hold for over 20 steps on a ladder, right down. Well, I didn't ever mind going up the aerials, which were 20 feet high, but I didn't like going down a bit. I had to go down to start the generator up before we could see how the radar was working. Well, we were there up till early afternoon, and they gave us some lunch in the shape of sandwiches and also drink. And it was a sort of warrant officers' mess, and they were determined, obviously, that they were going to get the ATS girls drunk.
Outrageous.
It's quite obvious. They kept on plying us with this drink. I can't remember what it was even. But we were very good little girls, and we weren't really used to a lot of alcohol at that stage. So we had a male corporal in charge of us, and another male driver. So we kept passing these drinks surreptitiously to this corporal. Well, by the end of the time when we had finished our work, he was quite drunk.
And you were all quite sober.
So we got him back into the truck, and we'd been told that he was having 48 hours leave, and his home was in Liverpool. So his friend knew where he lived, so we carted him off to his home. There was a long path up to the front door, and his wife saw us coming and opened the front door, and he had to be helped, one person each side, to this door. She was absolutely furious. But we did explain what had happened.
He was doing you a service, wasn't
he? He kept saying, "The things I do for England."
Lovely.
Anyway, there was also some forts out in Liverpool Bay which were kept there permanently. They didn't come in, they were chained out there. And some of the senior NCOs at the beginning were able to go out there and service that. I always wished I could have gone. But we all kept our equipment and everything spotlessly clean. We had workbenches, and we each had a toolbox with all our tools in it. And of course, very often we were out in the rain, and things got wet, and things got dirty. But at the end of the day, everything had to be spotless.
Did you have a sergeant checking you out, or you just did that?
No, I don't think anybody checked us.
No.
I don't remember.
You just knew it was important.
No, I think we were just expected to care for our own things. And we could have taught some hospital orderlies a thing or two.
It is an extraordinary story, and a marvellous story of rising to the occasion, isn't it? And here you were, quite young, quite sheltered,
Yes.
not educated in science or mechanics or anything, and suddenly plunged into this world, which is mostly a male world, and you are fantastic.
Yes.
I mean, this great group of women, marvellous.
Well, one reason why they started employing women was that they were so short of men, you see. But Sir Frederick Pyle, who was the Major General in charge of anti-aircraft command, had experienced a period when there were 700 German bombers coming over one night, and he realized that the London gun sites in particular were desperately short. They needed a lot more gun sites. They had planned before the war to have at least 70 gun sites in North and South London, in the inner artillery zone that's around London. But for various reasons, because there were so many demands from the Navy and everybody else, the number of anti-aircraft sites was grossly inadequate, and they couldn't find the men to do the work on them. So they decided, he consulted a woman engineer, her name was Hazlitt, whether she thought women could do this kind of work. There were the mechanical things like our equipment, And then there were the ATS girls who went in to man the other equipment on the gun sites. And she said, in her opinion, women would do it just as well as the men. And it turned out to be true.
Yes.
And in any literature I've read, most people said the women actually dealt with the predictors and all the other height finders and things on the gun sites better than the men had.
Yes. What I'm wondering about is a kind of emotional side, whether in emergency or the unforeseen, were women as good as the men in that situation?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, the ATS girls who manned the radar sets during the air raids, I'll tell you about the setup of the radar
later.
in a minute, but they were absolutely marvellous. And when the guns were firing, there was terrific vibration, you know, and they had to keep turning little wheels to keep a blip on a cathode ray tube, had to keep it steady. And I will discuss this more later. But they did it without shaking their hands.
Yes.
Their hands were steady.
Yes.
And they really behaved impeccably.
Yes.
So the first mixed anti-aircraft battery, as they called them when the women joined the men, was at Richmond Park, and the girls there demonstrated to other groups of girls who were being trained on managing various pieces of equipment.
You still part of REME?
Mm-hmm.
You still part of REME at this stage, or have you changed designation?
I'm not talking about REME at the moment. I'm talking about the Royal Artillery.
Yes, okay.
Who were manning the gun sites, or womaning the gun sites.
Yes.
There were more women on the gun sites than there were men, because the only job that was confined to men was the actual firing of the guns. Well, now I'd better go back to Upton, on the Wirral again.
Yes.
Because we took all the REME trade tests. We were just treated exactly like a man.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really rather an extraordinary situation, because the ATS officers didn't like women being employed in these sort of jobs, partly because we had to work very closely with the men, and they were afraid there would be bad behaviour, and they were afraid this and that. They were afraid of losing control, really.
Yes, yeah.
So they kept saying to the Royal Artillery girls on the mixed sites, oh, well, we could easily move you somewhere else to another job. Well, I think Churchill would have had something to say about that. And with us, they didn't seem to realise that we needed proper clothing. Because when we went to Upton, we just had our service skirts and tunics with brass buttons, and we had greatcoats, but of course we couldn't work in those, and we had denim overalls. Well, we went and there was winter, and it was very, very cold, and we would have to climb up onto these aerials and work for 2 or 3 hours on the aerials. And we got extremely cold. I don't think we even had boots.
Which is dangerous, isn't it? It would be
Well,
cold
it was
upper
just
upper month.
appalling.
Yes.
So we endured all this. We put masses and masses of warm pants on and sweaters under our overalls. But in the end, in the snow, I was working on an aerial one day, and I got so cold that I became quite ill, and I couldn't get out of bed the following morning. I had very bad kidney infection and so on. So when I recovered, I was thinking of going for a commission, because they said they were employing women as radar officers, just starting. So I went to be interviewed by the senior ATS officer in Liverpool to be vetted. And my father said to me, you've got to speak out about this clothing business. So I did, in no uncertain terms. And the senior commander, as she was, luckily was extremely intelligent. And she said, well, of course we realised that the girls who were working on the gun sites, the Royal Artillery, had to have all these warm clothes, but we hadn't thought of you. So when she discovered that I had been quite ill, I had 3 weeks at a camp reception station, within a week we got all we needed. We had warm slacks and trousers and underpants, and we had boots and gaiters, and we had wonderful special mitten things which we put over our hands. We got everything.
Yes. Wonderful.
So then I had to go for OCTU. I had to go first for a 3-day selection board.
Now, you're just going to have to spell out what that
OCTU,
is.
Officers Cadet Training Unit.
Right.
And so I had to be vetted. Was I suitable to be an officer?
Yes.
And we had 3 days selection in Hampstead. And it was really hilarious, some of the things they made us do.
Oh, let's hear those.
Do you want to hear?
Yes,
the story?
I'd very much like to hear what you had to do to prove you were officer material.
Yes. Well, one thing was we were divided into groups of 10, and we were shown into a room, and there was a wall of chicken wire at one end, and behind it there was a row of very senior officers with brass and red on their hats and God knows what, and they were watching us. Inside the main room there was straw all over the floor, and we were told that we had been lost on a moor, and that we had to spend the night in this hut, and that we would find certain things under the straw that would help us. So of course we did. We found all sorts of things like kettles and water and hundreds of things. Well, of course, we were told, get on with it now, you see, and we've all unearthed these things and looked at them. There were some of the HS cadets who were very bossy, so they just tried to take control and said, do this, do that, you see, and you put the kettle on and so on. Then there was a group who were very passive, and they were quite happy to be told what to do. And in the middle there were people like me who were trying to show officer qualities.
While being a battery hen.
Absolutely hilarious.
Yes.
There were all round all the downstairs rooms there were jigsaw puzzles on tables, and some people spent a bit of time on these jigsaw puzzles, but I avoided them like the plague because I thought they would show something wrong, something bad. Then there were films of various things, and we had to, we were given a lot of words and had word association, so we had to jot down what we thought occurred to us immediately. And so that evidently showed up some rather sinister traits in some people, because they were hauled off to see a psychiatrist. But I wasn't. My answers weren't interesting enough, obviously, so I escaped there. Oh, there were lots of other things, but I haven't time to tell you. Or anyway, I was passed. I got to Octu at Windsor, which is the most boring experience I've ever had. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that. But there were 5 ATS girls among the 200 cadets. There were 5 of us who were going on into REME to be radar maintenance officers, but we weren't told who they were, and I never discovered any of them during the training period, because we didn't see a lot of each other. We only saw our own little group.
Yeah.
Well, I hated having to learn how to treat these little ATS girls who we were supposed to be going to be in charge of. You know, they had all sorts of Part 2 orders and things we had to learn how to make, and how to treat girls who'd been absent without leave and so on, which I thought was pretty pointless. So I survived Octu, and then I went on to Petersham. Now, Petersham was the radar training place for officers, and it was near Richmond, Petersham. It had a big old rectory building, which was where a lot of the lectures took place. And then there was a whole series of nissen huts where they demonstrated some of the equipment to us. And one thing that we had to learn how to do was to calibrate a radar set. And calibration might need explaining. It means that you have to have the radar set working electronically and picking out a plane. But you also have to have some kind of visual equipment so that you can test that the radar is pointing at the right place. It's a great simplification of what happened. But they had to have planes flying round and round in circles at different heights so that we could test the equipment. Well, we weren't having a calibration lesson that afternoon, but we were dealing with something else. And suddenly we heard a most horrible screeching noise. And we looked out, and then there was a thud. And we looked out, and there were bits of yellow, bits of an Anson trainer floating down. Another group of people had been learning how to calibrate, and the local RAF people always supplied these planes, and they always chose people who were in somebody's bad books, naughty boys of some kind. So they had this dull job of flying around all afternoon, and then they were told by a signal that they could go home. And this particular plane had a pilot and a wireless operator, and the pilot decided he would do a victory roll. You can't do a victory roll safely in an Anson. And the whole thing...
A victory roll is just turning the plane
yes,
round and round.
Sort of did the thing
Yes.
like that and turned
Yes.
over. Anyway, the whole plane disintegrated, and the engine and the pilot and his operator went into the back of the main building of the radar school, right through the headmaster's office, the headmaster being the commandant, we called him the headmaster.
Mm.
Well, we rushed out to see what we could do to help, and extinguished all cigarettes because the whole place was thick with petrol fumes. Well, it was a most extraordinary experience, and again very vividly in my memory, because as we got near the building, above us there were windows opening with people looking out, and they were all white, not white with fear, but white with plaster from the building which had been shaken.
Yeah.
So it looked terribly funny.
Yes.
At the same time, one was aware that the
tragedy.
pilot had been killed.
Mm. And the headmaster?
And well, then, after a few minutes, people began to realise, oh, that's awful, this is quite a famous scientist, and how dreadful, what a loss. And they were all rummaging in the debris to try and find him. And then, after about half an hour, the headmaster came rather jauntily up the drive. He'd been out to the cinema that afternoon without telling anybody.
Extraordinary.
Mm.
Extraordinary. Yes. And that's, I mean, as far
But
as I can
that
gather from your story.
comic
Yes.
experience
Yes.
remains with
But
me.
it's your second experience, isn't it, in the whole wartime episode
Yes.
of collapsed building and trying to rescue somebody? I mean, you
Yes.
were in the first one.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, it was a horrible thing,
Yes.
because one of our team went to help dig, and they found bits of hands and things, you know, it was
Yeah.
too awful, they were so also terribly upset. Anyway, the training was, I think, 4 months, and before I went, I'd been warned that there was an awful lot of mathematics, and there was a lot of calculus. Well, of course, I'd never been taught calculus at school, so I got myself a little book, and it said on the flyleaf, what one fool can do, any fool can do. Well, I started into this book, and I soon discovered that there were fools and fools. However, we all struggled with the mathematical side of things, because we had to know about how to adjust the aerials, you see, and it's all to do with phasing, which is the various ways the electrical charges go on the aerials. It's all very technical. And so we used to sit there and scribble down delta so-and-so over delta so-and-so, you know, and it didn't really mean a lot to us. But of course we didn't really need to understand that side of it so much, because we weren't going to be changing aerials on our gun sites. They were set for each gun site. So, and the other thing that amused me was that we were learning how to use the radar on searchlights as well. They had completely different radar. Well, I was a very naughty girl, because when we came to the end of the course, there were 2 sets of examinations, one for searchlight radar and one for gun sight radar. And I'd been working on gun sites for 2 years in their ranks. So I was determined I wasn't going on to searchlights, which I thought awfully boring anyway. So they had the searchlight exam first, and I sat there, and they had 5 questions, so I just did 2. You had to pass over 50%. So that was that. I didn't pass the searchlight exam. Then the following week we took the gun sight exam, and I passed that all right.
Yes.
Well, then I was wondering where on earth I was going, and they said, where would you like to go? So I said, rashly, stupidly said Dorset, because I had friends down there. Well, of course, in the army you never say where you want to go, because they never send you there.
Is that true?
Well, that was the
How it
general
seemed.
opinion anyway.
Okay.
Because they said, you're going to London. Oh, I said, oh, all right. So off I went, reported to the First Aircraft Workshop Company headquarters, and it was late in the afternoon, and they said, well, we won't do anything more with you tonight. We'll put you up at the local pub and deal with you in the morning. So the adjutant there looked at this quite young little girl and thought to himself, oh dear, we should be all right. And he was so fatherly, sort of more or less patted me on the head, and I thought, oh goodness, what am I in for? However, in the morning they took me to the REME workshops first, because I would be dealing with them a great deal. And from there they told me that I would be seconded to the anti-aircraft mixed battery at Hampstead.
Yes.
So they took me to Hampstead, and I met the battery commander there. The battery commanders are majors usually, and Arthur Goff was an absolute dear. He was such a nice man, very sensible, and he seemed to take it quite in his stride that he'd got a woman radar officer.
Can I just ask how many is in a team, manning, womaning a gun?
On the gun side?
Yes.
I have never really counted. I should think probably a couple of hundred.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I thought perhaps it'd be a good idea to describe a gun sight to people.
Yes, please.
Because some people think it's just 2 or 3 guns and maybe a radar set thrown in. But it was really like a small village. If you went in at the main gate, there would be a big NAFI building. Then there would be the battery office. Then there would be a workshop for the REME personnel. And then there would be a sergeant's mess and our ranks mess, and there would be sleeping quarters for the girls, 2, 3 huts, and sleeping quarters for the men, and garages and God knows what. And then there would be the command post, and the command post was a large concrete affair. Oh, I don't know how big it would be, about 80 feet across, I suppose. Partly underground and partly a concrete top on which you had the girls who were managing the predictors and so on. You've seen pictures of them, I'm sure. And down below there was a large square lit from below where you could see the planes coming in when we were on target. Then there was room for a gun position officer who could be a man or a woman. And there were telephones and there were all sorts of means of communicating with the guns. And
how many guns?
Well, some gun sites had 6 and some had 4. I think we had 4 at Hampstead. But I also had, what I had to do was take command of a REME detachment of radar mechanics who were on 6 of the gun sites around that area. So I could swap them around according to how many we needed on each gun site to do anything like that. But each detachment was seconded to the Royal Artillery to be attached to them. But I had control of the men, everything except the medical equipment, and I used to have to go round the various gun sites to see that the men were all right. That was one rather minor thing. I had a truck and a driver sited at Hampstead.
Yes.
And
what's your status? What's your title at this time?
radar maintenance officer, they're called.
Say it again.
Radar
Maintenance officer. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
And there were about 6 of us in North London. There were 70 gun sites in the whole of the London area, north and south.
Yeah.
I was the only woman doing that job in the north, but there were 2 sisters who were Jewish sisters who were both scientists.
Yeah.
So they were much more highly qualified than I was. They were in the south, stationed near Kidbrooke workshop. Well, what I had to do mainly was supervise the work the men were doing on the various gun sites and check that it was being done properly. But then those radar sets were extremely vulnerable, and they frequently had things going wrong with them, particularly the valves, but also other parts. And so if a radar set on one of the gun sites went wrong, it meant that the gun site was unable to fire.
Yeah.
So it was really very important. I would say, have you tried this, have you tried that?
Yeah.
And they would go away and try, and sometimes they'd say, it's okay now. Other times they would say, no, it's not anything to do with that. I don't know what's wrong with it.
Yeah.
And then I would have to go over to that gun site.
To another gun site.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
To diagnose the faults.
Yes.
The radar sets were quite large. There was a receiver and a transmitter, and the transmitter worked on 20,000 volts. It was very high voltage. And ours had a certain wavelength, 56. And when the transmitter sent out a beam, theoretically, if I put it very simply, it hit the plane and bounced back, and the receiver got it on their cathode ray tubes. But there was nearly 8 tons in this transmitter and 6 tons in the receiver. But there was room in the receiver for 5 people to sit, with 3 cathode ray tubes, and one ATS girl in charge of the 3 who were turning the handles. And then there was room for me as well when I wanted to be there.
This is a huge thing. I mean, it's bigger than a room, isn't it? It sounds like a room. that you're working with,
Yes.
not just a television set or an
No,
armchair. Or
I think people have strange
Yes.
ideas about what it
Absolutely.
was like.
Yes.
But there were over 100 valves in those radar sets, and all sorts of resistors and motors which could go wrong, you see. And if something fairly minor went wrong, the radar mechanic would deal with it, and he would take it into their REME workshop. I described we had one on each gun site, and they would take new parts out, and the whole set was metal. It was beautifully constructed. Corsa made them, and it had drawers which pulled out so that you could you didn't have to replace the whole radar set, so to speak. You could work out which section of the set the fault would be, and you could take it out and test it. It's very difficult to describe. But if it was something seriously wrong with one of these sections and couldn't be dealt with on the site, we had to go take it into the REME workshops in Park Royal or in Loughton. We had 2 REME workshops, and they would give us a replacement, and we'd take it out and fit that in. But the mechanics did a very large amount of all that work themselves, because they were properly trained, and they had to do a certain amount of maintenance every day, because of course the transmitters had huge insulation areas that had to be kept spotlessly clean, and they had to test various resistors and look at the valves to see if they looked if they were going rather peculiar, which is called making the valve soft. So that we had a great many spare valves on the gun sites as well.
Yeah, what I want to get is a sort of time shape to this. What stage did you go to Hampstead, and how long were you there for?
Oh, I stayed at Hampstead for the rest of the war.
So what was the date when you went there?
I took my orchestra training in June 43 to August, and then I was sent to Hampstead in September. And
so it's just about 2 years that you're doing this work, isn't it, on Hampstead?
Well, let me see, I started the first lot of training in autumn 41, and I stayed on the gun site until the end of 44.
Right, yeah. Was it all exciting? Were you learning new things all the time? About the electronics, the electricity, the radar system. Was it changing, and were you learning more all the time?
Yes, we were learning all the time. Yes,
so it never became mundane?
Oh no, it was very, very interesting indeed.
Yes.
It was, I always felt that it was parallel to a doctor's training, really, because there was a lot of diagnosis to be made. If you could see very often if a valve wasn't lighting up or something, you could say, well, that's not working well. Is that working well? Is that working well? And you could eliminate and finally trace where the fault was, just like a doctor would do with an illness.
Yes. does your wartime experience finish at the end of that? Does it finish at the end of the war? Does it finish in 1945?
Well, the gun sights, of course, ceased to be very useful when the V1s came, because we couldn't fire at them.
Now, let's just, for those people who don't know about V1s, there were doodlebugs, which were unmanned, sort of unmanned aeroplanes.
Yes,
Could you deal with those? Did you have to deal with those doodlebugs?
yes,
Yes, and then there was V1s and V2s, which
V2s.
were faster.
yes.
Weren't they?
V2s were the big rockets.
Yes.
They fired right up into the stratosphere practically, and came down 10 minutes later.
Yes, and radar couldn't pick those up.
No.
No,
No.
it
Well,
could. It
because
could
war
pick
had-
up the doodlebugs, could it?
Oh yes.
Yes.
Well, we'd had. I haven't really told you about the raids.
No, you haven't.
Well, there was a raid the very first night I went
Oh,
to Hampstead, of course.
yes.
And I was taking over from a male colleague who was going out of REME altogether. But so I went over to the transmitter, and I discovered that the transmitter had been having a problem, and it kept on turning itself off. So luckily, from my other ranks experience, I knew what the trouble was. He hadn't been able to discover, but it was a time delay switch which was put in to prevent the full voltage going onto the transmitter before the valves had warmed up.
Yep.
So I got one of the mechanics to fix that the following morning. But we did have quite a few raids between the early part of 43 until about May the following year. We called it the Little Blitz. Now, there were different kinds of radar sets. When the big blitz happened, the gun sights were very inadequately manned. There were only a fifth of the number of gun sights that there should have been. And that's one reason why the anti-aircraft was so inadequate, and why so many planes got through and did so much damage. But by 1943, we had a more advanced kind of radar, a Mark II it was called, and we had far more gun sights. That was the general picture. And we had several raids during the period I mentioned. And some of them were incendiary raids.
Yes.
We got a whole bread basket full of incendiaries, which came down intact. Do you know what a bread basket is? It's,
No. I know what an
when
incendiary bomb is.
When the incendiaries left the plane, they came in a big sort of baskety thing,
Yeah.
and they were supposed to break up immediately
Like
and fall
cluster
to
bombs
the
did.
earth.
Yes.
And this one hadn't, and it fell down just a few yards from one of the HO sleeping quarters huts. So, but we couldn't attempt to put it out because it's dozens and dozens of radar of incendiaries.
Yes.
But then another night, I had decided that I wanted to look to see how the radar was working. So when the raid started, I went over to see how the girls were getting on. And after a few minutes, the girl in charge said, "Ma'am, would you look out of the door please, and tell me what it's like out there. She said their command post had told me something. So I said, yes, of course. Well, she couldn't take her eye off the cathode ray tube,
Yes.
so I looked out, and there were incendiaries all round the radar set, and there were dozens and dozens of them, all flaring away happily.
Yes. They're a phosphorus bomb, aren't they? I don't know how they work, but they just set light to whatever's there, don't they?
Yes.
So were they setting light to things, or were they just burning themselves?
Well, they just stuck into the ground,
Yes.
and they weren't doing any harm to anybody.
Yeah.
But it was extremely lucky that none of them landed on the radar set, which was wooden, had a wooden roof. And
Yeah.
So I looked out and I shut the door quickly and said, everything's fine out there. Well, the following morning, the battery major was so intrigued by all these incendiaries, he sent somebody out to count how many had landed round the radar set, and there were between 50 and 60.
So you were very lucky. Yes.
Yes. I sometimes had to go out to another gun site in the middle of a raid. That wasn't much fun.
No.
And once going north, we heard a screeching noise and a thud quite close to the road. But we were going to this other gun site, so we arrived safely and dealt with the problem and came back about a couple of hours later to find that the road was closed and there'd been an unexploded bomb. That was
Yes.
one. And another time, I had a piece of equipment which was giving trouble and which we couldn't repair. So I took it into the REME workshop at Park Royal. This was in the middle of the night. As they said they could replace it. When we got there, we found that they'd tested theirs and it wasn't any good. So I would have to go up to Loughton on the North Circular. So off we set to Loughton. And there were flares everywhere, so it was all like broad daylight. But there were also incendiaries coming down, and there was a hospital on fire on one side of the road, and then there was a huge gas main which had blown up and was flaring away happily. And then there were incendiaries, about a dozen, which had landed in the road, and they'd stuck straight down into the tarmac and were flaring up happily. I had a wonderful little ATS driver, and she trundled on quite happily and swerved round all these incendiaries to get to Loughton.
Fantastic.
But at our off-site, each gun site had an off-site, which was a similar sort of site, but was under the same control as the other one. So the battery major was in charge of both. But there was a captain on our off-site who decided that he wanted to give the site a new fence. It was, you came off the main road and there was rather a lane-like road, and the fence was on this side. So he got his men together and they found some wonderful, very large, spiky wooden posts, and they hammered them all into the side of the road, and it really looked magnificent. Well then, within a few hours, there was a terrific uproar. Further down this lane was the GPO research station. That's what we were told it was. In fact, I discovered quite recently that it also contained a special bunker for Churchill and Co. in case of anything happening in central London. But in addition, it had been the place where the Colossus for Bletchley Park was being built.
Now, just for
No.
those that don't know, that is the computer for Bletchley Park, which is the intelligence centre. Is that right?
Yes.
The code breaker.
Well, there was a terrific rumpus because the power supply for GPO had suddenly vanished.
It had fence posts in it.
Yes. But what had happened before that was that Mr. Flowers had been working on this special research equipment. He was a young scientist who was the first man to put valves into GPO telephone exchanges. And he was given a task by Bletchley Park of trying to produce something electronic which would replace some of their mechanical equipment at Bletchley Park, which wasn't behaving awfully well. So he took about 9 months to do that. He did it at the GPO research station, just up our road. And it was called Colossus, as you probably know.
Yes.
It was the very first computer that was ever made, I think.
Yes. Yes. Did your sister not work at Bletchley Park? But I don't know if you were. Is this a good place just to talk briefly about her and her work?
Yes,
Because it's very interesting that she was working on that side of things. You were really hands-on on the radar and the anti-aircraft area.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, my sister was...
That's Brenda, isn't it?
Yes, Brenda was a fanny at Chester, first of all, driving ambulances and staff cars during the Liverpool raids. And then intelligence caught on to her in Chester because she was a German speaker. She'd spent 2 or 3 years in Germany before the war. She was older than me. So they took charge of her, they pinched her from the fannies, and then she was asked to go to Bletchley Park. But I was able to go to Bletchley Park at least twice to see her there, because I was security cleared, of course, with the radar. So it was very interesting going there while it was actually working. It was never bombed.
No.
The Germans never knew about it. The security was so good. But I think Brenda never talked about what she did there. But I think she must have been translating. You see, they had little outposts all round Bletchley Park, and they picked up signals, German signals, and then they came into Bletchley Park and were decoded. But then, of course, they were in German.
Yes.
So Brenda would have been translating.
Yes. Interesting. I don't want to spoil the flow of your story, but I want to just ask you about what happens after the war for somebody like you who's been intensely involved in a very exciting world. It's very new, it's very specialist. Then what happens after the war?
Yes.
And
yes.
This must be a problem that occurs, you know, in any post-war situation, but I'm just asking you, what happens to you after the war?
Yes. Well, during the war, I had studied a book by Sir James Jeans called Physics and Philosophy. And I was very, very much stimulated in my thinking by this book. I can't give you all the details now, but in a way the rest of my life was partly governed by my thinking. I had been going to read French before the war, but I decided that my French was too rusty after the war. So I read English in London, got an English honours degree, and then I felt I had a call to the ministry because my parents were Presbyterian, so I was brought up in the free churches. And so they sent me to Cambridge for 2 years, theology, and I found that awfully boring. It didn't really suit my way of thinking. However, I completed the course. And then I did 5 years chaplaincy work, followed by being ordained at the City Temple, which is a huge church on Holborn Viaduct. It's the sort of cathedral of nonconformity. And there was a famous preacher there called Leslie Weatherhead, who attracted enormous congregations of 2,000 each Sunday. So I went and worked as his assistant for 2 years, but then I developed very high blood pressure, and the consultant I saw told me I'd have to give up that work. So I went back to do what I had already been trained to do, which was psychiatric work.
Yes.
I'd spent a year at the London School of Economics, doing what was called the mental health course. And so I spent several years after that, 2 of the London teaching hospitals, doing psychotherapy.
Yes. It's a very interesting story because you have all this intense training in the war. You're an expert in radar, you're an expert in electronics as it was then,
Yes.
and electricity, and you're hands-on. You can do all sorts of practical things, but you didn't take up anything that used those skills, did you?
No.
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 Isn't that...
I don't know why, really. I think I would have found some of the mathematical side very difficult. And in a sense, my mind went back to pre-war days and
Yes.
what I had intended to do.
Yes.
It hadn't been for the war, you see.
Yes. It was picking up where you left off then.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Is there something else you want to tell us about the kind of wartime work or the dramas of being part of a gun village?
Yes. Oh, there were all sorts of stories. I had some tragic things that happened. One was on the off-site, where these stakes had been driven in
Yes.
to the side road. One of my radar mechanics over there was killed by a bomb, which fell between the command post and the radar, and a large lump of it went through the transmitter where he was working with the girl in charge there. It took his arm right off at the shoulder and killed him instantly. That was terribly sad.
Yeah.
Then there was another case where a man on one of the other sites had been complaining of bad headaches, and he was a very solid sort of person. I thought, he's not making this up. And sometimes when I went over, he was lying down, and sometimes he was up and not looking very well. So after a while, I checked that he was receiving proper medical help, and they said yes, he was under the MO and being seen regularly. And then one day he went swimming on his free time and collapsed in the bath and died. He'd had a cerebral aneurysm.
Yes.
And I was very upset about that. We had a military funeral at Rookwood. But Royal Artillery people kept the medical notes of my men, but they had to go back to the REME workshop, so I was given them to take back with me. And I read these notes, and it said, this man is not as old as he pretends. He should be treated with scant sympathy.
Terrible.
And I thought to myself, thank God I didn't read that before he died.
Yes. But there were no MRI scans then, were there?
No.
So they couldn't necessarily have detected something like an aneurysm. Yes. Yes.
But when the V2s came, we were still on the gun sites, and luckily some of them exploded in mid-air before they landed. And this happened over the Dollis Hill gun site. And there were bits of rubber and bits of wiring all over the gun site. And I thought to myself, when I saw this, thank God it didn't land. Could have destroyed the whole gun site with about 100 people on it.
Yes, yes. I think I'm just thinking about modern children who are used to the idea of rockets. I mean, warfare now is conducted with rockets of all sorts of sizes.
Yes.
But then it was a totally new thing, wasn't it?
Totally new.
And the first ones, which were doodle bugs, which
Yes.
made that chug, 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 chug noise,
Yes.
you could hear, but they were unmanned and there was something sinister about them. The V1 and the V2 rockets were faster, silent,
Yes.
but it was a totally new thing in those days, wasn't it?
Yes.
Totally new form of
Yeah.
warfare.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Actually, I much preferred the V2s because you didn't know they were coming, and suddenly there was an almighty crash somewhere, and that was that. But with the V1s, you see, you could hear them coming, and you didn't know if they were going to come directly over you or whether they were going to pass you by.
Yes.
And so you had all the tension of waiting for the engine to stop, when very often it wasn't really necessary to be frightened because it was going across away from you.
Yeah.
But it affected some people quite badly.
Nervously, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
And
That's another interesting thing, really, because we're now been at peace a long time. How do people cope with living with that kind of stress and tension? Is it just that you get on with the job and therefore you ignore the stress and tension?
yes, of course, I never was afraid of being killed, because I'm not afraid of death, but I think all of us were afraid of being injured.
Yeah.
But no, you just had to concentrate on your job and get on with it. And I don't think many people panic or be